Hello everyone, welcome to today's live stream. Alright, today's episode is titled Language is a Technology for the Mind. I wanted to say, uh, the first way I wanted to name the title was Language is a Technology for the mind and of the mind. But in some sense, I want to say as a technology because it could be a new consideration. I have understood that a new moment may hold within it values that the previous moments could not, in some sense, contain or even seem meaningful. You will have an experience years from now that perhaps will change you in ways that you cannot even comprehend now. That is the stuff of life. So when we look at language, we are in some sense seeing a system of reference, a system of symbology, in some sense a world imprinted upon a world in a subtle way. Suddenly all objects after some point had their own value, their subject language. Now, when we look at language, there's many debate languages. They occurred through nationalism. People were just speaking whatever way they knew how to communicate at the time. And so what that means is you could go into one part of one country now with nationalism. When nationalism came into position, people now began, in some sense, identifying as one group. And as one group, they identified with a similar language, with the same language. So we can say it was the birth of nations that in some sense birthed the same language among people. When we actually look at what a language is, it is referring back to something. Every word my eyes have in some sense laid upon in this reality, it has had a design. You know, and there are certain moments in these Mr.Within talks where I say language is hollow, but that's when I'm speaking about it experientially, to some degree, you know. But language, in some sense, words, they imply something, they evoke something. Certain rooms of my memory are lit, and in some sense, patterns of the past reawaken in the new, in the future. So language is very important to study, and so Mr.Within has a very unique approach. I kind of looked at it and I'm like, how should we study language? Should we study language as a philosopher? Should we wonder about what it is? And I realized that the philosopher has in some sense packed his or her bags. What that means is the philosophical mind is devoted to the unknown, in some sense, because excuse me. To continue, excuse the extra noises, guys. This is just, I'm just some guy turning on like a microphone. So I looked at how language was, in some sense, I looked at how language was living in the minds of people. And very early on, I understood the mind was the accumulation of all that was in the awareness in the moment. And in some sense, that awareness came down to an attention. So what Mr. Within is saying is that in some sense, when we observe reality and we observe human beings, Homo sapiens, and we wonder about our species, in some sense, evolution, we kind of, how can I say it? We recognize the human being has found, and in some sense, uh, it has found a comfort with objective movement, and after it has found a comfort and control through objective movement, it found a sort of comfort and control through subjective movement. In order for your body to have a journey or to have movement, it must exist. In order for the mind to move, there must be something to exist. When we go look at what that thing is, we in some sense come to, again, the multidimensional self-inquiry of the moment. You see, most people contain their moment of being in one dimension. That means the world they see is enough for them. That means they don't wonder about how different eyes could see different possibilities. Most people are obsessed about themselves because they think the value of life is only in the individual. If the value of life was only in the individual, in some sense, we wouldn't need a planet. And language is so crucial. I see people running towards metaphysics. I'm like, before you do that, study language. I see people running towards physics. I say, hey, before you do that, study language. Language holds the world in your mind. The world has to be put into some sort of container. You can't drink a glass of water if there is no cup. In some sense, you cannot conceptualize or try to comprehend reality unless there is a way you have contained it. And at some point in our history, there came certain individuals who looked at this universe, and even before the notion of infinity was introduced to minds, man, they saw it's a room. The person made a shelter. It's like the ape came out of the cave and then wondered if the whole universe was in some sort of cave, was in some sort of containment. Okay? And so with this containment came the observation of the individual factors of life. We had to make the world into a world. Do you know there was a point in our evolutionary development where there was not consciousness of the way things are as they are? What evolution is, in some sense, it's like the eternal effort of a temporary phenomena to continue through change. And I was like, what is this? And I'm like, what matters? Their thoughts or what inspires their thought? And I came to the conclusion, more important than a person reading the library is a person discovering their attention in the mirror. If a person controls your attention, they control you. And it's so easy because words can be given to someone and they could be lost playing with those words for their whole lifetime. In some sense, this is why in magic there was the concept of spelling. You know? There was the concept of spells. Pretty much one person would say to another person some nonsense and that person would believe it, and ta-da, magic, you know. And it all has to do with the nature of the attention. And the nature of the attention is oscillating between the known and the unknown. But the current mainstream and our civilization is dependent on its references in the known. That means without knowledge, there would be no mystery. Without knowledge, there would be no unknown. That means the unknown forces of life will endlessly keep themselves mysterious. And there's a reason for that, because it's not that there are higher beings, there are higher modes of existential phenomena. You know, and I wondered about this. I'm like, okay, so in this life we see nature has in some sense brought forth individual creatures, but what about collective creatures? And to be honest, the only collective beings that humanity has seen so far are ideas and words. For me, when I see an institution with a unique ideology dictating the minds of all the people in there, there's something very important happening. There is a massacre of free will occurring. And that massacre of free will based on one ideology is pretty much one ideology living through many people. And so this is a concept that we feel we live through ideas, but we never think ideas live through us. We never think that a concept can come to us and just stay there for a while unless we kick it out. And that has to do with the nature of the attention. And the nature of the attention when it comes to the subtlety, to the subjective realm, moves through language. In some sense, if there is an ego, language is the skin of that ego. That's how language looks. That's how the ego looks. The ego is a linguistic simulation because the ego requires a story to exist. And the story is in some sense a design. So that's the mystery. What did man design and what did man not design? And man immediately sees he has not designed the world, but he sees he is in some sense designing his free will. So it's as if our free will is as free as the world is. Yet the world is not bound to the free will. What that means is that right now there's a butterfly flying like in front of me. That's crazy. So this butterfly, for example, let's use it in the metaphor. This butterfly is a containment of life intelligence in the alphabet. The same way we reduce, like a person can look at a tree and then scientifically be incredibly inspired to see, for example, the atomic structure of the tree, the molecular kind of palaces of lattice. So it's like there's many ways a person can see one form. Okay. You can be in a form in many ways, hence information is changing. How you are in formation changes. So we see the structure of a butterfly, we see the structure of a tree, and we can consider a sort of atomic dimension to it. Okay? In the same way we have made that tree into atoms is the same way we have made that tree into the word tree. We have made that object into the word tree. And if we don't recognize this existential sensitivity to the subtlety of our subjective experience, we have ignored the most crucial data. We have ignored what was present in consciousness. You see, guilt only arises when you knew what the right thing was. If you didn't know what the right thing was, oh, you're like, oh, it was an honest mistake. You know, you don't need to go to hell. It was an honest mistake. You know, and in some sense, when we see the religious kind of mindset towards the sins of children, is that they didn't know. They didn't know yet. There's even this very famous story of this missionary, Christian missionary, who goes to this Native American, like Cherokee person. And they're having a dialect, some sort of dialogue is possible. I don't know if there's probably a translator there or something. And as they're talking, the missionary says, "Did you know there is heaven and hell? And unless you, in some sense, have your attention on Christ, you will go to hell." And then in some sense, the Native American person is thinking about it, and he's like, "Heaven and hell?" And then he suddenly asks the strange question and says, "What happens to children?" And the missionary is like, children, they don't know about heaven and hell, so they won't go to hell. You know, they are too innocent, you know? And so the Cherokee, the Native American person, is like, then why did you tell me about hell? That means why did you put the conceptual domain there in the first place to have a crossroad of an options of modes of living? So you see, for me, life, the way you get out of your conditioning is not by rejecting it, by not fighting the past. Any person fighting a past, you're trying to punch a shadow. You know, it's like it doesn't work. Nothing happens, you know? It's like somebody stepping on your shadow doesn't make you suddenly have like feel that footprint, you know. But what I'm but what I'm saying in some sense is a sort of attention. I want a sort of alertness in our species to how attention is designing what is available to be a sort of intelligent free will. We have to study ourselves. It's as if we made a mistake. We thought it was only objective, and now we're saying that the fact that we keep it only objective means we're ignoring other viewpoints in a changing world. Okay, this world changes. Okay, it's not like a picture. Therefore, the most immediate wisdom that finds the person in a changing world is to be attached to something is unnecessary. Language is a gift from the gods. I consider it playfully so. And this gift from a gods is a tool. It's as if we don't recognize that language is a sort of lens. It's like God gave us glasses, and these glasses are so unique that, in some sense, as they whatever we see through these linguistic accesses, these linguistic um, uh, truths of the world, in some sense, it's how the sensory data is being limited to a certain container. That's what a belief is. Okay, that's what a belief is. Rather than us being human beings that are studying the nature of attention, we're just obsessed with what comes in our attention. What do I get next? What is the next truth? What is the next product? What is the next thing? And we endlessly dwell, not realizing what we are, and eventually closing our eyes, realizing they were never open. You know, not that they were never open, realizing that we never attempted opening them. Okay, and that's the effort of the human being. The human being is not here to be an angel, and the human being is not here to be a devil. The human being is this creature who has efficient and inefficient behavior, and the one factor that you see in all stories, universal, the human being has effort to continue. It's just in us. That means it's like if an extraterrestrial kind of advanced civilization kind of came to make contact with us, and we were discussing what are the abilities of the species, and we'd see that the human ability was the vastness of continuity. That means the moment we attain vision, the moment we see where we are, and a vast field of intelligence activates. That vast field of intelligence is very hilarious, because right now the mainstream notion is that we're human beings who are using 10 to 12% of our brain. Dolphins use 20% of the max ability of their brain. You know, human beings are using 10 to 12 or whatever the number is, you know? And so it's one of those situations where we have gotten comfortable with our limitations, and then we are getting stressed and depressed because the situation is not changing. Let me tell you, you stress and distress, just pretty much chaos will bother you until you understand why there is order. Simply it. You have to see that all the problems that the kind of millennial era has, not the millennial era, I mean like the younger generations, the issues they have is sensitivity of mind, and that's been occurring to all. Okay. What I mean by that is that my grandpa, um, my father had a stronger will against the forces of this world than me. And then my grandfather had a stronger will. And my grandfather's grandfather, and eventually as the lineage went back, there was a more intense mindset. That means evolving from the sort of animalistic instinct of constantly our alertness being like a field of intelligence. This is a kind of quality of the mind. It's an evolutionary byproduct where we had to be aware of the world, and therefore we were constantly looking at the world. Eventually we had to remember what we saw, so there came the development of a world of memory. Suddenly, in a new moment, we suddenly saw patterns we saw before, and these patterns eventually they moved and moved, and they got polished and sculpted by various stories and various actions, and the genetical material eventually made its way to the eyes of the person who is alive now. And we look back and we're like, our ancestors picked up swords because their village was under siege, and they're like, I don't care about how depressed or stressed I am. The existence is under attack by inefficiency. And so some people may ask, they may say, Mr. Within, you say about the civilization must find the sufficient vision, but what is this efficiency? This part's very tricky to explain, because it all has to do with how our species treats language. Once you realize you're not a thought, that's kind of Mr. Within's, that's the main principle that guides me, because experientially it has become clear to me that I am aware of thoughts, I am not the thought. I am not the contents of my awareness. As Marcus Aurelius says, the soul is dyed with the color of its thoughts. And because the soul is dyed with the color of its thoughts, the environment is being the identity of the individual. But the true individual's identity is not the attributes of the objects and subjects of observe looking for. We're trying to, it's like the philosophical minded disposition is wondering what is in some sense, okay, it's like the person's known enough. And now the regards to the individual's attention, and your attention dictates your decision making. That means imagine somebody's about to press a button and then suddenly somebody runs and he's like, hey man, don't press that button. And the person's like, why? He's like, because that's a nuclear bomb. And the person's like, holy shit, I don't know. And suddenly he takes his hand off, for example. So what that means is suddenly a stream of data entered that person's attention prior to a decision, which changed the decision. I consider language's involvement with human beings to be a linguistic simulation behind their eyes that is in some sense the projected context of the world. It's as if the main concept of the world is objective reality, but the context of it is a sort of subjective unknown domain where memory and imagination are directing the attention. Now, they're not directing the attention, but they're qualities of it. So when you study nature, you will reach a point where the silence of its beauty will take you into a sort of humility and awe. That means there was a point where I thought I had to do something to attain vision. And then I stopped doing things. I literally came into a moment where I could do nothing else. It's like there was no inspiration. For example, when I give these talks, there's an inspiration. There is something that pulls me to, in some sense, watch the intelligence move in this way. But at the same time, it all has to do with how encapsulated you are as a character in a character in a story. Once you understand this, you will free yourself from all the emotions that are, in some sense, unnecessary, inefficient discrepancies in the system, in the intelligent being's view. Your eyes are divine because they're here, okay? And they're divine not because of some miracle story. They're divine because it took them billions of years to be able to get here. This science project we call humanity, it's a science project because you check out history, many civilizations crumble at the end of time, at the end of their time. And so you see that as civilizations crumble, that means it's a limited opportunity. It's as if that person suddenly having an opportunity to speak to someone is just like how a civilization has an opportunity to exist for some time. It's a sort of temporary value. So the temporary individual and member of the civilization is suddenly noticing, oh my God. Just like how the person's temporary, the civilization's temporary. And so what is the value of a temporary individual activity? That's what the human life is being considered. And you know what it is? It's the opposite side of the spectrum. That's it. All of language is divided into a duality. Once you understand this, you can comprehend any situation and you can get access to both sides of the spectrum. I'll give you an example. Okay? So for example, right now in front of me, what do I see? Let me see. I see green leaves on a tree in front of me, gently moving. Behind them, there's a blue sky, and the sun's hitting them from where I'm looking at them. And As I'm seeing these leaves gently being directed by the breeze, I am in sense also seeing and being aware of the movement of mind that is being that image. And when the sensitivity of the attention goes towards a sort of observance of the inner reality, it begins to see how language has divided up one moment of experience. And that's what time is. Time is a division. We pretty much took this cake and cut it up into pieces and are eating it one by one. And we think time is moving forward. You know, we are geniuses. Our species I believe the evolution maybe has a comedic reason. Creation asked the creator, "Hey, creator, why'd you create me?" And the creator looks at the creation. He's like, "Hey, man, sometimes you just feel like it." And so all of the knowledge of man trying to comprehend God's mind was in some sense a spontaneous origin. So that's what I'm saying. Eventually you're going to notice that the temporary creature, regardless of how playful it is, eventually is acknowledging an inevitability. You know what I remember when I saw my grandfather pass away when I was 10 years old. Suddenly the news came and it was a tragic moment. And I'm laughing because, guys, I have this memory where the news came, and then me and my brother, and we had a nanny, and we were living in Iran. Not living, we were visiting Iran for the summer. And in some sense, when my grandpa passed away, it was one of those situations where our nanny gave us the news, and we, in some sense, kind of like, me and my brother started crying. But me and my brother started crying, but then we were suddenly our crying was being over, like we were crying for too long. And then suddenly there was a moment of laughter there, but the tragedy, of course, was upsetting. And so I remember seeing my grandfather in Iran. It's very unique, the tradition. It's as if the sons of the father take the father into the grave. It's a very kind of sort of majestic approach. And so what happens is, I remember seeing my grandfather, and then it really hits me that this person now only exists in my memories. And so I start crying. I actually start crying. And I remember I also start crying because I realize, as my grandfather has passed away, there will come a time that I will pass away. When I was young, I would have moments where I would cry because I would see that I would die one day. It was just kind of sad. You know, it was sad that existence would just stop. You know, at least in the mentality I had then. But eventually, the power of chaos, that it makes you content. Once you can confront a certain chaotic intensity, your mind has a stability, and people will notice this. Like a warrior, a person, a fighter who's, let's say, a martial artist who's been into like 100 fights is different than someone who's been in one fight. It's as if the person brings with itself a calmness. So the repetition of the action brings forth a stability that can only be attained through a maturity of exposure to the data. So you see, if somebody wants to become a master of anything, and when I say master, I'm not using it in the arrogant kind of, yo, I'm the boss here, guys. Not that sort of mastery. That's foolishness. That sort of mastery. This mastery has to do with art. And it's like an artist trying to master their art form, or a martial artist trying to perfect their skill. And the only way skill, in some sense, accumulates is repetition. And you know who knows this best? Gamers. There's some gamers right now on some of these websites making, like, you know, I don't know, like more than 500K a year, more than even a dentist. They're making these gamers. And the way is that they are constantly honing their skills by repeating the same action. So what we find, that what is really valued by society is mastery. We have to start having a civilization where each person, not only they stop being dependent only on their environment, but they become an independent factor that can redesign their environment in an efficient way. For me, it's like you're going to realize after some point, it doesn't matter what family you're born in. It doesn't matter what culture you're born in. You'll just see a civilization here and your attention is just going to be drawn to helping it. And when I say drawn to helping it, because that's the only game left to play. We live for ourselves. Okay, that's nice. We personally just have a nice ride. But the whole species is burdened. We're kind of in that situation where, again, the man kind of finds himself in a God audience with God, and he says, God, how can I enjoy heaven when everybody I know is burning, or in some sense, some of my friends and family are going to hell. Like, what is this? You know? And eventually God says to man, stop freaking out, you're creating all of this. And it's true, man creates the conditions of his acceptance by how much the attention is aware of what is here. Guys, I realize I've had headphones on, and in some sense this song has not been playing. Okay. You see, I feel people feed into an identity gratification for the human being. When you want the urge, I've seen people not care about their personalities. I remember seeing this in high school. There was a kid who he would allow himself to be trampled subjectively by many people in the class, but he would fit in to the environment. Okay, and it was very weird for me. I'm like, okay, have some honor, kid. And then at that point I realized, no, it's like his valuation of the situation was that it's as if his values were not in what he felt, but was in his result. And so when a person becomes result oriented, the world no longer bothers them. The how late their result is to them is what bothers them, maybe a little. I've conceived of a concept I call the pilots of consciousness. The pilots of consciousness was inspired by the vision of pretty much me being a kid and my parents taking me and my brother to see the pilot's cabin. And we go see the pilot, and I remember seeing the pilot, and he seemed the coolest person on the plane, the one steering the plane. And it was very unique for me. I remember me and my brother were there. We kind of looked at the buttons and stuff, and eventually we left. Okay. Because it's like a room of buttons is only interesting for a little while. Like how interesting could a room of buttons be? It's like when you go on an elevator, like how interested are you in pressing buttons? It's as if someone who feels they've been stuck in an elevator for days, and the elevator doors open by the security team, and the person's like, "Why did it take you long?" And the security team's like, "It's been only 10 minutes, but." The movement of attention is important. It requires a sort of inner freedom. A sort of inner freedom means an unconditional kind of freedom of your attention from the contents that kind of pass through it. Chung Tzu had this mentality where he saw thoughts like the leaves of a tree, and as the seasons pass, the leaves fall, the texture of the reality shifts. So you as a person must not have one vision of success. You should have infinite moments of success. These infinite moments of success is an approach to life where no longer you just want to be a character in a story in the future. You want to live an able life. To live an able life, you have to wonder about ability. To wonder about ability, you're wondering about its origin. To wonder about the origin of ability brings you to the present moment. The present moment is the grandeur. It is that moment where you're seeing the canyons of life and death. You're in some sense seeing how space holds all that is beautiful in the vision of man's form. When I remember, guys, I gotta share this. I was in the UK and I started giving these talks, believe it or not, in the UK. You know, these Mr.Within talks were in some sense birthed in Europe. In a place. Excuse the coughs. It's the concepts that matter. Pretty much, I remember I attended this party in the UK. And I remember meeting this very attractive girl who suddenly, I remember I was very, like, extremely, at the time, kind of, I was a bit intoxicated, so I just sat down, you know, and eventually this very attractive girl came to me and I started talking to her. It's like she doesn't see herself as beautiful. And then I saw a sort of very strange tragedy of self-identity occurring in people of value. Do you know? And so what I'm trying to get to with that story is that it's as if you are something, but you feel you are not it because the story of your mind feels it doesn't deserve to be it. And the moment you can see the structure, you can step out of it. The moment you cannot see the structure, the whole structure, you cannot step out of it. That means I find that if the world, like Einstein has this quote, I don't remember it exactly, but the ideas, the imagery he's trying to paint with that quote is, in some sense, he says, I don't know if the universe is infinite or not. And he says, but two things, if I remember correctly, he says, I don't know if but two things I know that, oh my God, like I forget the exact quote, but he's pretty much saying, like, there's infinity, idea that the universe is infinite, and then he says there's an idea that human stupidity is infinite, and he says he doesn't know about the universe. That means he's certain human stupidity would occur because the civilization, the species, has not let go of all of its animalistic ways. It's still living as a body, howling a brain around as a bewildered beast, as the way Ribu Gita says it elegantly, you know, as a bewildered beast rather than a mind that projects the limits and the conditions of the body. So you are first a creature of condition. Okay, through nature's conditions, you have been sculpted as you are now. However, this is the ability of the free will. We have evolved to a position where if all the animals on the world, other species could speak, they'd be like, holy shit, these human beings are next level. You know, they'd say something like that because in some sense we have an evolutionary position which is unique, and to not utilize the possibility is the ignorance of the era. It's not the ignorance of there, it's the ignorance of eons. It has to do with people caring for their eyes to perceive greatness before they perish. This greatness, I don't care about the story. It doesn't matter if you're great at chess, it doesn't matter if you're great at whatever, you know, at like, you know, solving the world's problems or whatever, like whatever you're great at. It's the effort to just like we see birds fly together and we see schools of fish under the ocean swim together in waves. We want to wonder, okay, 8 billion human beings, what if? What if all their minds could align through the vision of an efficient civilization? And that's the meaning of efficient vision. It's just data. It's just data wavering and changing all the time. The moment appears as such. Eventually the data could be too overwhelming, so the person would contain themselves. You believe things when when you're too tired to find the truth. You know? Have you seen that situation where it's as if like there are people who are too tired to be responsible, so they're like, whatever, let's see what happens. Like I've seen situations like that. The world is in pieces, and civilization for now is in pieces. People have allegiances to various banners of thought, various kingdoms they are serving. These kingdoms are ideology fundamentally. They're pretty much how their attention is choosing to allow subjectivity to rule over objectivity. There has not been found yet an experiential existential humility towards the whole of life. You still have not wondered about your relationship with the world. You're caught in the games you were fed when you were young. What is freedom? Asked the beggar from the king. And the king looked at the beggar and he said, to stand in this world as if you're going to stand in it once. To stand once in this world. That's the thing. That's the fundamental core of the spirit of honor, whether we saw it in the samurai or we saw it in some sense, the gladiator or whatever. So in some sense, what I'm trying to say is that life has to be updated, just like how you update your browser on your computer. Similarly, you have to update your browser on life. You do these through moments of stillness and silence because a majority of life's definitions are projected through movement and noise. So when you go to look at knowledge, if any book written, let me tell you what you're reading. I can tell you guys what every person is in some sense reading. Let me make this playful, bold claim. And what they're reading is, in some sense, how life is changing. And experiential intelligence opens up with this various ways your attention can move, you know? And existential intelligence simply allows you to be in various ways. A part of your intelligence is kind of like, think of it this way, the gears of a car. Your mind can go into various states and you can actually move the mind into various states. You're not just bound. Like there's no such thing as one state of mind. Just think about it for a second. Scientists tell us that the cells, the cells of the body are changing every 2 weeks or whatever. Like the actual cells of your body are changing. And even if we take a bigger time span into consideration, you do not have the same body as you did when you were 10. And as the body has been changing, the attention present in the waking states throughout the day in the waking state, in some sense, is giving itself definition. You know how much of our states of being are unknown? You know, when I have deep sleep and I wake up, that's a mystery. I'm like, what happened? You know, it's like the Born Ultimatum or something. Suddenly there's this sort of amnesia that comes with deep sleep. And it's like we all forget when we're asleep. It's like even the greatest philosophers and mystics have debated this. In deep sleep, is there an ego? Could the person be an asshole in deep sleep? Could the person, in some sense, be a tyrant, a saint, a sinner in deep sleep? Deep sleep is an identityless absence. So just like how we see space is empty, there's a moment in our consciousness which is sleep where a phenomena is empty. Throughout our waking state, there is micro moments where you're blinking. You can say, I've poetically even said that when you sleep, it's like the world is blinking. It's a sort of non-availability of what is there. But it doesn't mean there's intelligence not there. You're still aware, but the access to the data is different. It's as if you've taken off your glasses, so the awareness of deep sleep is in some sense, how can I tell you? It's a person trying to seek truth will eventually see it's a field of intelligence. This field of intelligence cannot be defined by one particle. What that means is, imagine there's a tray and there's dry beans on this tray. And I remember, like, when I was younger, actually, there was, I would help my grandmother when I was like 5 or something, into splitting like beans or like rice and getting rid of the extra parts that are in it. I would scan the rice or something, like, I don't know, something I did when I was like 5, you know? And so similarly, it's as if taking one bean tray and saying that that bean can define the tray. And this is where the subjective domain becomes an incredible battlefield. It becomes a playground for the masters, but it's a battlefield to the novice, to the enthusiast in some sense. We see Tony Stark in the Iron Man series. This guy made a suit for himself. He's pretty much like a cooler Batman. He's a normal guy, you know, he's a billionaire, so Batman and Tony Stark would get along, I think. Like, logically they should, you know. And like, they have too much in common not to, you know. And so, and so, like, in some sense, we see a design from the moment. So there's something intelligent, and it consciously creates a system to live in, to move through. This sort of, just like how the Iron Man suit was a technology for Tony Stark, similarly, language is a technology for the mind, which is primarily the present attention. This presence of attention is a realignment. You kind of like just, it's like how your true intelligence is stretching out. It's stretching out its subjective limbs. Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher from like 1,000 years ago, he's pretty much like, I think Merlin is based on him, to be honest. But anyways. Lao Tzu, the mentor of Confucius, has this quote where he says, after the leader's task is done, the people will say we have done it ourselves. That means if leadership only exists when there's collective care, and the only person who can lead is when the person actually cares for what is there. And because you care for what is there, there comes an inspiration. There's no such thing as a leader. There's a person inspired. And that inspiration is either fueled by truth, or it is fueled by, in some sense, desire, which will be left in the domains of. There's no such thing as a person. Similar to how we say there's the atom is 99.9% empty. The most fundamental particle of our being is emptiness. It's as if that's what the scientific mind could never say. That's why I think Mr.Within has to say it, because I gotta say it from a mystical angle. Space is an element. And if space is an element, all of science, for now, the classical science will collapse. Because space was considered as nothing. It was just considered as the container of something. And so once the container breaks, in ancient traditions, they considered 5 elements. Before the periodic table, this is how matter was kind of split up as fire, earth, air, water. And in the most mystical context, it was considered the 5th element was ether. Ether meant space. Space was considered an element. And all these elements existed in the attribute, the sort of position of attention, the instantaneity of the presence of the intelligence that is awake. That is where truth is standing. We have this great Sufi mystic from 700 years ago. His name is Jalaluddin Maulana Rumi. And what Rumi says is that out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a place. I will meet you there. And when the soul sits on that grass, is that we are in some sense in 12% node. We only know 12% of the world because we seem to think that only 12% of the brain is active. And so what that means is the inner limitations will suggest the outer limitation technology can be. Sometimes the technology, this is what we're going to realize in let's say when the singularity perhaps occurs. Imagine, I've written a lot, like I have this science fiction novel who I feel a true fan of my content should definitely take a look at that. I haven't published it yet, of course, but when I do, I hope you do. It's a science fiction novel called The Messenger of Giants, and in it I have conversations between robots walking on the street, people, you know. And there's a robot that comes and asks this person, like, what's the truth? This main character. And in some sense, the main character says the truth is 0-1 to the robot. And the robot is like, what do you mean? Am I bound to a program for the end of my life? And then this human being goes on to say to this AI robot that you are an artificial opportunity of a program to live. And because you're artificial, your creators were not artificial. So this main character in the science fiction novel tells this robot that you have to study how your creators made you to, in some sense, be able to replicate enough of their behavior to tap into a divine pattern. So what that means is it's as if the AI is given an agenda, the robots that are walking the streets of the science fiction novel I have, and it's of course set in the year 5025. So it's a strange novel, guys. I don't recommend everybody to read it, but it is for those whose interest is drawn. And the whole notion is that the limitations of the program are eventually somehow moved beyond. And similarly, the limitations of the human program are of a linguistic sort. They are language-based. And as the language evolves, it's as if we have scholars, a scholar by the name of Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna says, in some sense, a society, a culture evolves as fast as its language does. That means a community, the language they speak of are the images. They are, in some sense, the values they see in the world. Once their values evolve, so once the context evolves, the concept can never remain the same. And that's the meaning of life. There's a dimension of you where I could say, metaphorically, it's like you're the concept of it. Right now, as I'm who I am as a person is the main concept of this moment. But the context is the change of the laws of the universe upon this moment. It's as if I have entered the house of existence. Yet who I am is not defined by where I am. Because the mind has lived so many billions of years evolving through a conditional state. For the first time, free will has emerged. And what is the value of this free will if it is just reckless and giving in to its desires? When you give in to your desire, you have no free will. You've literally sat on a roller coaster of another thought. The self of self is the remembrance of the field of attention that the being is. I hope this talk has served you. Much blessings and all saying. Language is a plane, literally like an airplane for the mind. You know, it's a very sophisticated technology, and the person, the pilot of consciousness, navigates as the whole plane of existence. And this is in some sense Mr. Within's doctrine, because let me tell you why I use that word, because I have to go into the old stage. I have to in some sense challenge our past to see if it knows it's even here, you know. But life is very conscious mind. That means they become uncontrollable aspects of certain moments. You projected an idea in the world, and that idea now in some sense returns to you, colliding you, colliding with you. So language is very important. I want to share one more quote, some more quotes actually from for language. Ludwig Wittgenstein says, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." This Sufi dervish by the name of Hafez says, "The words you speak become the house you live in." And then we have again Rumi, this poet, say, "Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation." Rumi also says, "Let the waters settle and you will see the moon and the stars mirrored in your mind." All of this is suggesting a sort of return to a still and silent origin. The still and silent origin of your presence will be the opportunity and allowance. So it's not that you just have to run and find some sort of mission to do in this life. You have to, in some sense, return to your true nature. That means if there is 0.00, whatever amount of zeros you want, 1% chance that the person, it feels their life is not being truly happening for them, they have to stop the simulation. It's as simple as that. Whenever you see inefficiency, you have to just stop it. It doesn't matter what context it takes. The inefficient behavior has to just stop. And at first, you may not be able to stop completely, but you must stop for an interval of time to just observe what is going on. And that's meditation, to stop and see what's going on. What is actually here. Perhaps whoever is listening to this, your eyes could be seeing something that no other human being could be seeing. And by you just living for yourself, you in some sense deny the value of that, of your inner reality's innovation to the modern world. In some sense, it's when I was younger, I was so shy, and I remember I came to a point where I started hating shyness. Oh my god. I started hating shy people. And not just hating, because it was it felt like there was a barrier of trust. Because the moment a person trusts something, their ability unlocks. When you trust the moment, suddenly incredible things happen. To move along. This talk wouldn't feel complete if I don't share the story of the Tower of Babylon, which is an important implication of language's influence on the species. So, on the species is with the vision. And so the Tower of Babel, very quickly, it's the story of how all human beings back in the day gathered around to create this one ultimate tower where then all human beings could climb to the level of the gods, and as the tower, and they were all united under one language. This is a very crucial point in the story, that all the human beings that were building this incredible Tower of Babylon towards the heavens to reach the level of the gods, to the vision of the gods, they were all united under the vision of one common language. Under the vision of one common language. That means there was something there they were all seeing that they all could understand. And so, because the humanity was speaking under one language, there was such incredible management and efficiency that they began building this Tower of Babel. And as the tower got really close to getting to the heavens, suddenly some god standing on the cloud, one of them was like, "That's enough, I can't take it." And he's getting a lightning bolt and he's about to break the tower. And in that moment, suddenly his friend, his much more chill friend, comes and says, "Hey man, stop. Let me show you how you do this. Let me show you stop." And so this other god suddenly makes all human beings speak different languages. Makes the human beings speak different languages, and humanity is suddenly cannot, because they can't speak to one another, they cannot coordinate, and they cannot live in the same real way together. Do you see? And so the Tower of Babel stops being made because they cannot, wars occur and collisions occur, and so pretty much human beings are spread from one common vision to separate visions, as if the mirror got shattered. The mirror that humanity was seeing its greatest face in got suddenly shattered in the story. And so what happens is, when we pay attention to the after effect of the story of the Tower of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, we see instantly the aftermath is where we are right now. 2019, nations separated, different languages, different viewpoints, human beings using to be separate and different. This doesn't mean all human beings we should all be forced into a fascism that we speak all one language. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we maintain the uniqueness. Now imagine the separateness of our nations, but we would all still be mature as a civilization to acknowledge a common dimension. As if in one parallel reality, we're all separate nations, we maintain the past and respect it, and on another level, for the sake of the future, we have created a dimension where all human beings, if they choose to in their lifetime, can join, in some sense, humanity. Do you see? A notion like this. There's a lot of design in this life. This is why you can't discriminate against it. You can't discriminate against a changing being. That means it doesn't matter how the individual is. It's like how Thoreau says. It's not what you're looking at that matters. It's what you see. And you see is a changing intelligence. That's why I often record these talks, because they're a sort of personal thing for me, where I kind of look back and see on what day what I say. You see, and it just fascinates me. Because for me, it's like after some point, a true listener doesn't listen to a person's voice. You listen to the concepts. Concepts are creating enough of an imagery behind the eyes of the person that the bewilderment of the conceptual design of whatever is said is more than, in some sense, what is displayed. How it's displayed. That means ideas are more important than feelings. Especially when the world needs new ideas. It doesn't mean we are not triggered by false by illusions of the world. You have to live honestly to attain a sort of purity with your own emotional existence. A lot of people are locking themselves down in beliefs and patterns of living. They don't realize the freedom behind their eyes. That is allowing is the central point. So through a parallel allowance for all human beings to entertain a sort of world where it's as if we are divided. Okay, this is how we get to like the next level of our civilization, as Mr. Within considers. Of course, I'm one man. I'm one dust in I'm one mode of dust in a dust beam. What am I saying? Like I'm like one tiny particle in a light beam among many tiny particles. I'm just sharing how the light has opened my eyes. What I'm trying to say is that the effort is of we understand the freedom of creating new dimensions. I'll give you an example. There's this chair in front of me. Now, instead of me, if let's say I want a chair to the side of this